Well, today we wrap up this series that we've been in on anxiety. And my prayer for you is as we've gone through this series this month of October, that you could say that your anxiety has decreased, that you feel like you have some of the tools, some of the spiritual tools that God has given us to address this thing that has become an epidemic in our society, this problem of anxiety. So again, we've been saying this whole series that it's not about psychology, but it's about theology. These are tools that God has given to us to help us deal with anxiety. Anxiety is not just something that came about in the 21st century, it's as old as time. And so just as a way to increase our retention, and of course to help those of you who are new to get caught up, let's review what these tools are that we've looked at over the last 3 weeks. Remember our first week, we talked about knee pads as an illustration to hopefully create a mental image for us of a spiritual truth. And what did we say knee pads represent, what they stood for? That's right, grateful prayer, good job. And that spiritual principle comes from something that Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. And he said in verse 6, he was like, don't be anxious, don't be worried about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Thank God for what he's done. That's where it comes in about this grateful prayer, thanking God for what he's done. And then you and I will experience God's peace. And we said for you to start off every day thanking God for 3 things that he did the day before. That would remind us of God's faithfulness yesterday, gives us strength that God cares about today. And our bottom line that week was, we said, when looking forward makes us anxious, to look back and remember God's faithfulness to us. It helps us to move forward. And then the second week, we talked about binoculars, right? And what did we say that binoculars stood for? It said for us to do what? Look and focus. That's great. Good job. In Matthew 6, Jesus said, don't be worried about everyday life, what you're going to drink, what you're going to wear, what you're going to eat. He says, God, your heavenly Father knows you need those things. He said, look at the birds of the field. God takes care of them. How much more is he going to take care of you? And then last week, we talked about the visual illustration of potatoes, but not just any types of potatoes. What type of potatoes were they? Hot potatoes, that's right. And what did we say hot potatoes reminded us to do? Yes. That's right, we're to hurl our anxieties, we're to cast our anxieties onto God. We said that the Greek word epeiripto means for us to hurl these anxieties as far away from us. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7, Peter tells us to cast your anxieties, to hurl your anxieties onto God. Why? Because God cares for us. And then our bottom line last week was we said, God's going to take care of it. Why? Because he cares for me. God will take care of it because he cares for me. Well, today is our last tool that we unpack it. This is the tool that helps us believe, it helps us to trust that God is working. And when we are anxious, that's probably the hardest thing for us to do, isn't it? To believe that God is actually doing something, that God's at work even though I don't see it. Even when it's hard for me to believe it, that God is working. Anxiety says God isn't working. Anxiety says there's no one running the universe. There's no one who's pulling the levers. There's no one who's driving the universe. It's all up to me. I have to take care of myself, my family, my friends, my parents, and of course that creates tremendous anxiety. But we're saying that this tool allows us to trust that God is working. And is a key word. Not that God will work, not that God can work, but that he is in this very moment. I mean, think about the things that you're anxious about. You don't think about them too long, but what if you truly believe that right now, in this moment, even though you don't see it, you can't explain it, you don't understand it, that God's doing something about it, even as you sit right here. That God's working on it behind the scenes. Wouldn't that give you peace to feel that way? So what is our tool that helps us to understand and to trust that God is working? This is a tool that allows us to move forward. It's the tool that we're calling, of course, is the umbrella. I know some of you are just like, oh no, you got 7 years of bad luck. You open that up inside in a church of all places, what are you thinking? But of course, that's kind of what gives us anxiety, isn't it? This idea of luck, this idea of randomness. To think that, the things that are happening in my life No one is guiding them. No one is controlling it. And so it's just blind, dumb, random luck. And if that's what we can classify all of the events of our life, then of course it would make us very anxious. So this umbrella, here's what I want you to think about. This is this last tool that we have that helps us move forward, that helps us fight anxiety, is an umbrella. And what does an umbrella represent? It represents God's sovereignty over our life. Now you say, well, what does sovereignty mean? That's kind of a big theological word. And typically when we think of something being sovereign, we think about a monarchy, we think about a king or a queen and the power that they have, how they rule over an area. Well, you're on the right track when you think about that. When we're talking about sovereign, when we say specifically that God is sovereign, we're saying that he is over all things in power and authority. So just like an umbrella is over your body, we're saying that God's sovereignty is over every area of your life. It may help you to think about, as we're thinking about anxieties, you think about an umbrella policy when it comes to insurance. Ever heard of that before? It picks up where your other insurance has left off. So, you got your car insurance or your homeowner's insurance, and maybe you have some claim that exceeds the coverage that you have there, then that's where this umbrella policy picks up. It just kind of covers other areas of your life. And as we're thinking about these tools here, we think about grateful prayer, as we think about casting our cares, as we think about focusing on how God cares for the birds, so how much more does he care for us? These are your first level lines of defense, kind of like your homeowner's insurance, kind of like your car insurance. That's the first line. And then the umbrella picks up on the second. And that's where we're talking about with God's sovereignty is, you've cast it, you've prayed, you're focusing, but what allows you to get up and begin to move forward? It's recognizing, because sometimes it's hard, right? It's hard, like I prayed and I don't feel like anything's changed. I don't instantly feel a lot better. I mean, okay, I've refocused. It doesn't feel, it's this fever pitch inside of me anymore. But what allows me to get up and move forward with my life is believing that God is sovereign over all of it. You know how an umbrella works? An umbrella doesn't stop the bad weather around us. Do you know what it does? It keeps the bad weather from ruining us. So you have an umbrella, it doesn't instantly stop from raining around us, does it? But it keeps your hair from being ruined, if that's a thing for you. It keeps your clothes from being soaked, your backpack from being soaked. So the weather is terrible all around you. It doesn't change the weather, but it keeps the weather from ruining you for the day. God's sovereignty works the same way. It doesn't change the weather of what's happening around us. It doesn't necessarily change the circumstances at the beginning, but it keeps it from ruining our soul, from getting inside of us and beginning to rot our soul, for us to be consumed with doubt and fear and worry and anxiety. Instead to say, no, there is bad weather that's happening all around me, but it doesn't have to destroy my soul. I believe that this weather isn't the end of the story. Here's something else I want you to understand about an umbrella. An umbrella allows us to move forward despite the weather. You ever been stuck in your car before because you haven't had an umbrella? And you're just like, oh man, I was already late for the meeting. Now I'm really gonna be late for the meeting because of this downpour. I've gotta wait for it to stop raining, or at least for it to lighten up before I can get out and go inside. Or maybe you've ever been stuck inside at work, it's 5 o'clock and you're like, man, I gotta wait here 3 more minutes before I can go to my car because I gotta wait on the rain to stop because I didn't bring an umbrella with me. An umbrella allows you to continue moving forward despite the weather. So maybe you came in here with a lot of difficult things. You've used these other tools here that we've talked about over this month. This tool right here allows you to get up and begin to move forward and not stay stuck, believing that God is in control. Now, maybe you say, well, that sounds great, Pastor, but is there anyone in Scripture that illustrates this principle for us that I just didn't get into their soul, it didn't ruin them? I'm like, yeah, I can think of one person in particular. My mom asked me this summer, and she said, Over 20 years of being a pastor and all the ups and downs of starting a church, she's like, is there any story in particular that stands out to you above any other? I'm like, yeah, one that I often reflect on is the story of Joseph, this Old Testament figure. You remember his story? Now, here he is. He's a teenager. He's his dad's favorite. And his dad gives him a jacket of many colors. And of course, his brothers, that was the final straw, right? That was too much. And so then they plot to kill their brother, but then they realize, well, it would be much more advantageous for us to sell him because we get some money and then we don't have blood on our hands if we just sell him into slavery. They sell him into slavery. They killed a wild animal, put that blood on their brother's jacket, tell their dad that their brother has been killed by a wild animal. And they just think, okay, everything's fine. It's all done. We can move on with our life. And of course, what happens to Joseph now that he's in slavery? Can you just stop and think about that for a moment? I know some of you come in with some heavy things, some difficult things. But can you imagine how you would feel if your family, your friends, those people who are supposed to love you, care about you, have now sold you into slavery? Can you imagine the questions that would be going through your mind about God? Can you imagine, where is God in all of this situation, all of this pain, all of this confusion? I think you would definitely be questioning your faith. People have deconstructed their faith for a lot less. And here's Joseph now as a slave. So what does Joseph do? Joseph blooms where he's planted. Joseph begins to increase and not decrease. He continues to work hard. He works so hard that his employer puts him over every area of his house. But with that comes a problem. Now, his boss's wife keeps harassing him sexually every single day. In fact, one time it qualifies for sexual assault. But notice here what our scriptures say in Genesis 39. It says she kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her and he kept out of her way as much as possible. Now, why in the world would Joseph do that? It's something very, very interesting. Notice what verse 9 says. He says, how could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against who? Against God. Against God. Why do you care about God? Don't you see all the terrible things that this God has allowed to happen in your life? This God allowed you to be sold into slavery. This God allowed you to be sexually assaulted. This God allowed all of this wickedness and this evil into your life. That God doesn't care about you, so why in the world do you care what that God thinks about you and the choices that you're making? Because if there is that God out there, he certainly, by the evidence of your life, seems like he does not care about you. And so what does Joseph do? Well, of course, who's going to believe a slave's word? And so he is thrown into jail because of what he's accused of doing, which he doesn't do. He's accused of sexually assaulting his master's wife when she was the one who did it to him. And so he's thrown into prison. Of course, what does he do in prison? He doesn't languish. He works hard, blooms where he's planted. He increases. He doesn't decrease. And then the prison warden puts Joseph over everything. Notice this in Genesis 39. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. We're in trouble now, right? The prisoners are running the jail, right? And here's Joseph over all of it. Joseph interprets a dream for some of the other political prisoners who are in there. They forget about Joseph, but then Pharaoh has a dream. Pharaoh, no one can interpret it. They remember, there's this guy in jail. He interprets this dream, and in a weird twist, Joseph becomes second in command of all of Egypt. Now, his brothers find their way back to Egypt because of a famine that's happening. Now, how does Joseph interpret all of the events of his life? When you think about being sold into slavery, forgotten, abandoned. I mean, I think we could use our imagination to extrapolate all of the horrors that went on with him crossing the desert in a slave caravan. All the things that happened in that time, all the things that happened into prison. How in the world would he ever begin to, how does he keep his faith? Notice what Joseph says here in Genesis 50 and verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. You see what he says there? He says, God brought me. God intended this to happen. You know what Joseph was saying? He was saying, I didn't understand at the time why all these things were happening. But I understood one simple truth that allowed me to move forward. I believed that God was sovereign over all of the details of my life. That even though it didn't make sense at the time, I believed that it would make sense in the future. I believed that God would take the circumstances of my life and bring good out of them. Do you think that would allow you to not be anxious about the negative things that are happening right now? Do you think that the things that you're worried about, you can't sleep at right now, all the details, do you think it would help if you believed, I don't understand what God is doing right now, but I believe that someday I will. I believe that it's not random. I believe that it's not an accident, and that God has total power and authority over every event and every detail. Do you know what? Our New Testament says the same thing. Paul says this. He says, and we know that God causes everything to work together for good. It doesn't say that God causes everything that's happening. He's saying he's taking those details and he's working them together for good, for those who love God and are called according to his purposes for them. Joseph recognized that. He recognized that God was using this not just for his own personal good, but for the good of God's plan and what he's trying to do in this universe. Do you know what we're saying about God's sovereignty over our life? Is we're saying that God's sovereignty is active. It's not a passive thing. We feel like we're being passive, but God isn't being passive. God is working right now in this very moment as you sit here. God is at work moving things around that you don't see, that you don't understand. And one day you'll look back and you'll be like, whoa, it makes sense now. It doesn't make it easier what I went through. It doesn't erase the pain or the hurt, but I sensed that there was purpose in it. And Joseph held on to that belief from the very beginning. You intended it for evil, but I recognize that God was working in all of your motives that you didn't even understand at that time, that you couldn't stop God's plan for me and for my life. Do you know what anxiety says? Anxiety says, I'm in control. I'm in control. I have to solve it. I have to figure it out. Faith says, God's in control. He's over my life. It causes a ton of anxiety to think, I have to fix it for myself, for my family, for my parents, for my kids. But when I say, you know what? I can't figure this out. This is beyond my network. This is beyond my understanding. This is beyond my resources. Then I'm just going to trust that God is sovereign over all of the things of my life. Maybe we could approach it from a different way. What if I ask you this question? Who is watching over you? Who's watching out for you? There's a couple of different ways you could answer this. And maybe you say, well, no one is watching over me. Well, that's a sad thought. If that's true, and some people think that, if that's true, that means it's impossible for you and I to have a meaningful life. You can't have a meaningful life in a meaningless universe. You can't find purpose in a purposeless universe. The only way we can find meaning or purpose means that this life has to have some meaning and purpose in it. And we're saying here, our scriptures are saying, is that God is watching over us. All of the events, all of the details of our life. In Exodus 14, there's another passage. I come back to Joseph's passage a lot. I often think about Exodus 14, where it says this. It says, the Lord himself will fight for you. Just stay calm. And it's hard to stay calm, isn't it? We're like, somebody's got to do something. I've got to do something. I've got to figure it out. And here we see Joseph just staying calm, saying, I don't understand what's happening, but I trust that God is working in the backstory of my life. I've seen it happen so many times in my own life. Jesus says this, last passage I want you to remember today. Maybe this is the passage you need to take a picture of with your phone so you don't forget it. Jesus says this in John 13 and verse 7. He's talking to Peter about something that Peter didn't understand. And he says this, Jesus replied, you don't understand now what I'm doing, but someday you will. Someday you will. And man, when I reflect over the 20 years of being the pastor here, there's a lot of things I didn't understand what God was doing. But I reflect back on some of those things now and they make a little bit more sense. You know, when our first 4 services and no one from the community came, I just want to tell you, that created a lot of anxiety inside of me. You know, it's like, I think maybe we got it wrong. You know, every week, is someone coming? No one coming? I don't know what's happening. You know, God, did I mishear you? Is this wrong? Are we on the wrong path here that no one is showing up? And you know what it did as I look back now? Is it really drove deep into my heart that God says, I want you to be a servant and not a celebrity. For 13 years, our church was portable. Do you know what that means? I mean, it's like it's church in a box. We had 3 trailers. You know, we'd set everything up. Then we'd have to tear it all down. We went to 5 or 6 different locations during that time period. We were just like the Levites. We were nomads, moving from place to place, setting up our tabernacle and then tearing it back down. And it just felt like it was such a grind. But when I look back now, I see God's faithfulness and I see how God intended for us to put in our DNA as a church that the church isn't a building, to make sure that we are outward focused, to recognize that we exist for so much more than ourselves. How are we spreading God's love beyond our walls? And then the last building, the last thing that we renovated, we put a lot of money into it. And we were supposed to be there for 10 years, but we were only there for 5. I'm like, God, I don't understand why was that? That didn't work out. But I see now as I look back that God intended it to bless another church who was portable, moved into our old space. And then we were in the middle of all of COVID, the place that we were in, that place that we put a lot of money into, that then it goes into foreclosure. I'm like, God, I don't understand. Why are you allowing this to happen? God, it makes no sense to me. But as I look back now, I see that God was pushing us to this place. And then now we're at this place and it's filled up in 2 years. And we're like, God, what are you doing? I don't know what you're doing. But so, maybe God has this place for someone else too. I don't know. But we just trust God's plan in this. And to say that, God, we believe that you are sovereign over all the areas of our life, even the things that don't make sense right now in this moment. To say, God, I'm trusting you, that you are at the steering wheel, that you, God, are pulling all of the levers. And do you know what that allows you and I to do? It allows us to go to sleep at night. Anxiety keeps us from sleeping. Some of you know that. Some of you understand you're not sleeping well at night. Why? Because you don't understand that God is sovereign over all the details of your life. Psalms 4 and verse 8, notice what he says here. He says, in peace I will lie down and sleep. Wouldn't that be nice? To just lie down and go right to sleep. In peace, not with worry, not with anxiety. What allows us to lie down and sleep and in peace? For you, O Lord, will keep me safe. Believing that God is over every area of our life. Do you remember when your kids were younger, your grandkids, maybe you got to watch your niece or nephew one night and maybe a big old thunderstorm came up and they couldn't sleep, they woke up, they were crying. And of course you come in, you comfort them, you pat their head, you brush their hair aside. Listen, it's okay, I'm right here. You just go to sleep. Just rest easy right now. And what happens? They go to sleep. And why do they go to sleep? Because you're there. They trust that you are going to take care of them, that there's nothing for them to be afraid of. And what if that was also true for you as well? For you to say, listen, I know the weather around me is not great. I know that the storm is raging and I hear the thunder, but it doesn't have to ruin me. It doesn't have to ruin my soul. It allows me to begin moving forward. Why? Because I believe that God is in control, that he has power and authority over every area of my life. This didn't catch him by surprise. That God in some way and somehow at some time will bring good out of this. Good for my family, good for his kingdom. If I would just continue to trust him in this moment. So here's what I want to leave you with as we leave this series. Sleep well, God is awake. Sleep well, God is awake. You have nothing to be worried about. God never sleeps, he never slumbers. He's always awake, watching over you. God is working in your life right now, in this moment, in this time, even though you don't see it, even though you don't understand it. And that allows us, after we've done these things, to get up off of our knees and keep walking forward. Keep moving forward. Why? God's in control. And I can sleep well at night knowing that. Let's pray together today. Let me ask you, what's the thing that's keeping you up at night, that's making you anxious? I believe that God brought you here tonight. I believe that God put you here today as you're watching for you to understand that he doesn't want you to live that way, that he's over every area of your life. And this thing that you think is too big for him, it's not. I've seen God's faithfulness in my life over and over again. I've seen him make a way where there is no way. And I know that he will do the same thing for you. So would you just tell him, say, God, this is what I'm anxious about. This is what I'm worried about. I'm hurling it to you today again. Would you say, God, strengthen my soul. Help me as I wait on you. I don't know what you're doing, but I believe that you'll bring good out of it in some way and somehow. Father, today, as we come to the end of the series on anxiety and worry, we know that this is not your desire for your people. We know that it's a tool of the enemy to cause us to doubt you, to cause us to be focused on ourselves, because if we're focused on ourselves, we can't focus on anyone around us, much less the mission and purpose that you've given to us. God, we know that fear is from the enemy, that he wants to use that as a tool to keep us from moving forward in faith. And for my friends here today, God, I pray that you would strengthen their faith. You would help them as they wait on you, that they would believe even in this moment, even in this time, even as the storm is raging around them, that you're working right now in this moment, even though they don't see it, even though they don't feel it. God, we thank you for your shelter. We thank you for your peace. We ask all of these things in Jesus' name.